So in this video, I'd like to share with you a game of history, time travel, and most importantly, conditional logic. This is Chrononauts, the card game of time travel. In this game, we are going to play Chrononauts. We are travelers from other alternative timelines, and we are trying to complete missions and get back to our own time by changing the timeline of events from what those of us in the prime universe, what our history is versus what these alternative histories are. In this game, we have a timeline. Starts in the core game, it starts at 1865, goes to 1999. You can buy an expansion that will take you into the 2000s, which would go down below here. You can also get the early Americans Chrononauts, which would you could either play as a standalone or have an epic timeline that goes up here and creates doubles the size of your board. As you can see, I have not yet opened this particular card box. In the two-player version of the game, you will have a mission card of things, artifacts you are traveling through time to collect, or attempting to change the timeline to match the universe where you come from. Artifacts might be ancient wisdom from the Library of Alexandria, go all the way back in time to get a videotape of the creation of the universe, or maybe bring back a live brontosaurus. Some artifacts can only be collected if the timeline is in a certain state. For example, the Beatles reunion album. Oh, what a wonderful idea. The only way you could do this is if you were to adjust the timeline to prevent John Lennon from being murdered and switching it to John Lennon being nearly killed. In the multiplayer version of the game, it's kind of a race to see who can win the game first. I like the solitaire version of the game, in which you draw between 6 and 8 Chrononauts, and you're going to try and adjust the timeline to send each one of them back home. 6 if you're playing on easy, 8 if you're playing on regular. So to give you an example of sending a Chrononaut home, we have the Chrononaut Walter. Even time travelers can't change everything. Time travel was introduced during the 1948 World's Fair, and within 20 years, minor edits to the time stream had become commonplace. So when Nixon faced having to resign in the face of Watergate, he dispatched one of his aides to undo the incident. Unfortunately, it turned out the alternative to Nixon resigning was Nixon resigning. So in order to get Walter back to his timeline, you have to we're going to have to prevent the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and have Abraham Lincoln be impeached instead, and we're going to have Berlin host the World's Fair. And in order to set those events into motion, we have cards like Reverse Fate, Prevent Assassination, Halt an Attack, or Sabotage. And sabotage works both ways. We could sabotage the Hindenburg to flipping the Hindenburg to not explode to explode. We can flip the Manhattan Project to fail, or flip Sputnik to fail. And in this case, we would prevent assassination. So here is the Lincoln assassinated. We're going to prevent the assassination of Lincoln. And you can see here there's a ripples. It's a linchpin, ripples to 1868 and 1974. So when we flip this, Lincoln wounded. Theatrical event marred by attempt to kill the president. So now we've saved Abraham Lincoln, and in 1968, that is now paradoxed if Andrew Johnson impeached. And you can see here, paradoxed if 1865. So we have a single if statement here. We're going to flip that, and that creates a paradox, which can later be patched. Additionally, it affects 1974. 1974, Nixon resigns. Vice President Ford replaces Nixon after Watergate scandal. Paradoxed if Lincoln is saved and JFK is saved. Well, 1963, JFK has still been assassinated in this timeline, so this is not going to flip. We have not met the two and conditions to flip this point. So to get Walter home, we need Abraham Lincoln to be impeached in 1868. As you can see, 1868 is currently a paradox. So what we have is patch cards. So we can patch the timeline. In this case, Abraham Lincoln impeached. President escapes conviction and removal from office by 1 vote. So what you could do is on your turn, you could play a patch card. And now we have satisfied one of the conditions for getting Walter home. In order to finish getting Walter home, we need Berlin to host the World's Fair in 1948. In order to do that, we need to play this patch. 6 million tourists visit the futuristic expo. Nullified if Hitler, in 1936, Hitler opens the 1936 Olympics. Nazi leader makes speech at the Berlin Games. So we're going to take a look at this. This ripples to 1939, 1942, 1944, 1945, 1948. So if we play a reverse fate and flip Adolf Hitler assassinated, Berlin Olympics marred by sniper attack on host nation's leader. So if Hitler is assassinated, it's going to have ripples. So we'll check 1939, paradoxed if Hitler assassinated. So we're going to flip that. 1942, paradoxed if Hitler assassinated. 1944, D-Day, paradoxed if Hitler assassinated and an event has to happen. The Japanese have to be prevented from bombing Pearl Harbor in 1941. This is an and statement. We have not met the conditions for the and statement, so D-Day is going to continue. We're still going to have a war. 1945, A-bombs dropped on Japan. Now, this is paradoxed if Hitler is assassinated or if Japan is prevented from bombing the Pearl Harbor or if the Manhattan Project fails. So we have an or statement. If any of these are true, we can flip this, and that creates a 1945 paradox. Finally, 1948, Israel founded. First Arab-Israeli war begins. Paradoxed if Hitler assassinated, so now we have paradox. So you can see we're creating paradoxes here along the way, along with these ripples. So we also, if we had this card in our hand, Berlin hosts the World's Fair, we would play that here, and now we have Abraham Lincoln impeached, Berlin hosts the World's Fair, and Nixon resigns in play. So Walter gets to go home. With the board in this state, we are very close to getting Vincent home. We have the Berlin hosts the World Fair in 1948. And in 1974, we need President Martin Luther King to take office. And then in 2003, which is not seen here, we would need Saddam Hussein to be captured. So let's read this here. The Bush years remain the same. My 21st century is basically identical, except for those little differences you notice when you visit a strange place, like Bush comparing Hussein to Hitler. Who's Hitler? Where I come from, Stalin was the evil dictator of comparison, and Obama wasn't the first black president, just the first to get there by winning an election. So if we had the President King takes office patch, we could play that here in 1974, but we need it paradoxed first. So in order to do that, we could either play a reverse face or prevent assassination. In order to do that, as we notice, Nixon resigns is paradoxed if Lincoln is wounded and not assassinated and JFK survives. So we have an and statement here. So let's play our reverse fate for 1963, play it on Kennedy assassinated. And now JFK injured in motorcade shooting. Doctors predict full recovery. So the ripples here, it's going to ripple to 1968, preventing the murder of MLK and RFK. Then 1969, Apollo lands on the moon is now, that's not going to happen yet because Apollo 11 lands on the moon would be paradox if Sputnik failed and JFK was prevented from being assassinated. So we could create a paradox here, but since we don't meet the and condition, we're not going to make that paradox. And then 1974, because Nixon resigns and Nixon resigns will now flip because 1865 and 1963 have both been satisfied. This creates the paradox, which we can then patch with President Martin Luther King taking office. Vice President King becomes the first black president following the impeachment of Nixon. Now you'll notice here these patches also have nullified if, and there's an or statement here, 1865. If 1865 or JFK, if either of those go back to our own timeline, this patch would be removed and the paradox would then be flipped back over. one more fun Chrononaut is Squatrunt, who is a sentient cockroach anthropologist from the distant future studying fossils. This cockroach needs World War III to happen in order for their future to come to fruition. And in order for World War III to happen, we would need the Manhattan Project to fail or Sputnik to fail, during which ripples to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and where World War III was narrowly averted. We then, if we were to create a paradox, we'd have World War III, and World War III is neat because it eliminates the rest of the timeline. Nothing else can be played after World War III. So Squatrunt is a very challenging Chrononaut to get back to their home timeline, because getting Squatrunt back to their timeline usually makes it much more difficult to get other Chrononauts back to their timelines. So it's hard to stress enough how much conditional logic comes into play here. We have ands or multiple ands, this kind of conditional logic in keeping track of what the state of the timeline is, where the paradoxes are, what are the conditions to flip these. These are all just Boolean statements. Is Lincoln assassinated or is Lincoln impeached? Did the Hindenburg explode or was it okay? What happened? Did these different attacks happen? And that's the computer science kind of element to this game. The other thing I like about it is the cross-pollination here. In addition to computer science conditional logic aspect of it, is the historical aspect of it. This is a really interesting game from a historical perspective. It's also a great game in terms of speculation, a lot of what-ifs. And a lot of these what-ifs are things you need to know a lot more about history, and in order to understand some of the why would the Cuban Missile Crisis lead to World War III? Why is it interesting that Berlin hosts the World Fair if Adolf Hitler was assassinated? And there's a lot of interesting questions here, like why would the Statue of Liberty be destroyed if the 9/11 attack had been averted? Why would guns be banned if John Lennon hadn't been assassinated? Why would cosmonauts beat us to the moon if JFK wasn't assassinated and if Sputnik had failed? These many interesting factors that go into these alternate histories. And Looney Labs has a great little website talking about why they decided on some of these patches, why they decided world peace would occur in 1945. And I will include a link down below in the description of the video to Looney Labs' excellent article on their rationale behind these different patch choices. So we do need to take a moment to also address a problematic aspect of this game, and they address it here in their rulebook. Isn't it in poor taste to include tragedy X in a game like this? Chrononauts, and their answer is, Chrononauts is a work of fiction, and no disrespect is intended towards memory or the survivor of anything in this game. Tragedies are included because these are the sorts of events that would-be time travelers fantasize about undoing. Surely, more than anyone else, those touched by these tragedies would welcome a chance to erase them. And that's why I kind of chose the President King takes office. Why would Nixon have chosen Martin Luther King to be his vice president if we could have prevented the assassination of Martin Luther King? However, if that does remain a concern for you, and I think that's completely legitimate, if that is a concern for you, the sensitive nature of many of these events, there are alternative versions of Chrononauts that take place in the Star Trek timeline. Same game, just as fun, without the problematic aspects of it. And so that's Chrononauts. I can definitely recommend it. It's as an excellent solitaire game. I really enjoy it. I find it very insightful, very intellectual, and very educational in both historical aspect and the conditional logic aspect. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you'll check out Chrononauts and possibly its expansions and pre-expansions. And thank you so much. And if you like this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing.